Hello, and welcome back to Who Do You Say I Am? Encountering the Newer Testament. We are here today with Greg Carey, who is professor of New Testament at Lancaster Theological Seminary and co-pastor of Life Church Lancaster. Greg, thank you for being with us today. We are really excited to have you here.
Thank you, Margaret. It's joy to be here.
We are here today to talk about First Thessalonians and Philippians. So two different letters of Paul, and we can either take them both in turn or we might weave them in together. But this is actually really our first chance in this course to be encountering Paul's specific letters. We've had a chance to talk a little bit about who Paul is, but this is our first time reading through some of his work. And so could you just start out by talking to us about what it means to encounter Paul through letters? How does this form shape how we receive him?
Sure. It means a lot to take seriously their letters. He's sending letters because he has a relationship with these churches, but he can't be there. And if we take Acts seriously, he didn't get to spend a lot of time in Thessaloniki or Philippi. So he's using emissaries to communicate and deliver the letters and speak on his behalf. He's trying to do some sort of community organizing management from a distance. Those are tough circumstances. The other thing is we don't know for sure whether he has an accurate assessment of what's going on in those churches. We don't know for sure that he won the arguments he tries to make or persuades people in the ways that he tries to persuade them. So we should take very seriously these writing the letter and take very seriously also that he has carefully crafted it before it was sent.
Mm-hmm. So then what's he doing with First Thessalonians? What's he doing with this community in particular? What are the concerns that motivate him in this correspondence?
We're always guessing because our evidence is in the letter. We have to read between the lines of the letter. We have the impression that Paul spent a short time in Thessaloniki and got chased out. He talks about that some in chapter 2. Toward the end of the letter, he spends a longer time on one subject than he does anything else. And that subject is the return of Jesus. We get the impression that Paul taught the Thessalonians that God had raised Jesus from the dead. And in chapter 1, when he reminds them of what he had taught them, that's exactly what the message is, that God had sent this son and raised him from the dead, and that he's coming back. So in chapter 4, he begins to turn the conversation after giving some pretty general kind of encouragement. He says, we don't want you to be ignorant about those who have fallen asleep or died. Mm-hmm. And if we can imagine that Paul told people to wait for Jesus to return, later he says, we who are alive when it happens. So he seems to have been on a short time frame. And in the meantime, people have died. So does that mean they miss out? Does that mean that what he told them has no benefit? And it looks like he's writing to address that as a sort of a pastoral crisis.
Right.
So when will the rapture happen, Greg? What's the...
Yeah.
What does he say there in terms of what they should expect? And because this is a really important text for a lot of people who think they know how the world's going to end, right?
It is. It's the passage in chapter 4, verses 13 to 18, from which we get the idea of the rapture that is so widespread in world Christianity. And the idea is that Jesus returns in the air and takes believers who are alive up in the air to meet him. And at the same time, those who are dead are raised from the dead to join him with them. Paul says things like, it's like a thief in the night. We don't know when. But he also says, we who are alive, so he thinks it's going to be in his lifetime. So I don't think it's out of bounds for these Christians who believe in a rapture to have some sort of notion of that if they're literal Bible readers. The confusion comes when they mix First Thessalonians with other passages in all kinds of jigsawy ways without any context and try to put a timeline on it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's also possible that Paul's saying Christ is going to come back and we're going to meet him, and Christ will then be present with us here as opposed to taking us to another place, right? I mean, just from this very brief and very symbolic description alone, right?
The image of Jesus returning on clouds, right, is language that comes out of the book of Daniel. And it typically involves sort of this end time figure, a divine figure coming to make things right. So the coming down is important. He doesn't get specific about whether it's coming down and staying or coming down and taking up. And I don't go into much speculation about that myself. What he believes is this is the resolution of the fate of everyone who's in Christ, that they're delivered from the world the way it is now.
So what are the implications of that in Paul's message to this community? What does that mean for how he's urging them to live or believe or be present to one another?
This seems to be his good news, that in Jesus, God has intervened by raising this Messiah from the dead. And that is the beginning of the end of history. And Paul is, throughout his ministry, trying to build these networks who live a Jesus way in a short period of time over as much territory as possible. So the good news that he shares is that they receive the power of the Holy, this gets technical, they receive the power of the Holy Spirit through the resurrection. So they're living a joyful communal life as part of this networked movement. That's happening now, and that's good news. But also that he uses the language of they're being delivered from God's coming wrath. And so the return of Jesus is that deliverance. And that is why the death of some members of the community without having that information would create a potential crisis.
So there's an urgency here, right? Paul seems to think he's literally living in the last days, like doesn't know how many, but
yeah.
How much does that affect his overall theology? Like what we see even across this letter or across other letters? Like, is this baked into Christian thinking from the outset, that urgency?
I don't think there's any dodging that. Jesus too, and Paul and most of the New Testament are heavily Jewish apocalyptic thinkers, and that's what the movement mostly is. Jesus is talking about God's intervention to redeem Israel, and his followers after his resurrection are talking about the resurrection being the moment when God starts this process of repairing the world. And there's a lot of language in Paul that suggests, we have a short time. But also the other bit is the resurrection of Jesus is weird, not just from a modern point of view in how do we imagine a resurrection, but in the sense that Jewish apocalyptic thinkers thought the resurrection was something that happened to all of God's people at the end of this age, and Jesus is just one. So the resurrection of Jesus is the beginning of this process. Paul associates it with the language of the coming of the Spirit, like the book of Acts does, and says that it gathers the community and empowers them to live a certain kind of life. But this is an apocalyptic framework all the way through. I do not know how we dodge that.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can't dodge it, how do we live with it?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I asked that both in this sort of, the intellectual piece of how do we deal with the fact that maybe Paul didn't get this right, this someone so influential in the writings of our scripture, but also how do we deal with the fact that God hasn't finished repairing the world yet? So sort of pastorally and intellectually, what do we do with that?
Yeah, and Margaret, I think some of your question might reflect that we're modern people, and it's been 2,000 years.
Yeah.
And most of us could not convince ourselves to take this language dead literally, in the way that many Christian fundamentalists do, and look for a certain timetable and all of that. other Christians have tried to ignore it and say, well, we're going to follow the moral teachings of Jesus or whatever. I think we have to go through this language. And, you can't make yourself believe something you just can't believe, but to go through it and take it seriously. What Paul believes is that the resurrection of Jesus looses the Holy Spirit out on the world and transforms people and transforms communities, and that's happening now. That's language I can kind of make sense of.
Mm-hmm.
I struggle a lot more to make sense of what happens to a decomposed body being raised from the dead,
Sure.
people being caught up in the air. I don't know how to make sense of that.
Yeah.
But I can make sense of a story. Paul uses this language of the Spirit very close to his language about the resurrection in a lot of places. That the death and resurrection of Jesus together are this definitive opening of God's blessings into the world for Christians.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I love the idea of going through it, right? And going through it not to solve it or to translate it, but to, in some ways, sit uncomfortably with it. At the same time, in this letter, First Thessalonians, he's very concerned about this community and its holiness or its sanctification or its set apartness. And even in Philippians, he's concerned about relationships in these communities. So it's striking to me that even though Paul might think the world's about to end, he doesn't tell everybody to go out to the desert and live in caves or withdraw from economic life. He still wants these communities to function within what we might call an ordinary existence, right? So what do you make of that? Do you see what I mean? Like, how does the survival of these communities and the different ethos he's trying to instill line up with that urgent expectation?
Like, one option for Paul would have been to say, Jesus is coming soon, so put on your asbestos suit for in case there's fire or something like that. And he doesn't do that. He is thoroughly committed that these communities are in network with each other. That's what all this letter writing is about. He's thoroughly committed that they show love for one another and that they live distinctive kind of lives. And when he addresses this concern of, well, we've had people die before Jesus came back, what does that mean? He says, well, what it means is to live like children of the day, which is, sort of his way of saying, continue to live in the world, continue to practice the practices of Jesus. And even though it's urgent, even though the time is short, you don't know when. So keep living this way.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I want to sort of shift us towards looking at Philippians now. And we're deliberately beginning with First Thessalonians and Philippians, which scholars tend to assign as kind of the first and the last of Paul's letters. So we'll maybe see an arc or a development here. I would love for you to sort of pull that out for us. How is Paul, the Paul who's writing Philippians, has he shifted over the years? If you agree with us about where we would place it. I know that
I love that question. I love that question. And the way I would come into it is to think that Paul is doing just what we were talking about a few minutes ago, that his circumstances have changed and time has changed, and he's trying to take the same message, but now it looks a little different to him. So in Philippians, he reveals that he is imprisoned. And in the ancient world, if you're imprisoned, there's no sentence that says you're getting out in 4 months or 8 months or 2 years, right? It means they have your body in a cell or a dungeon or something, likely in chains, and you may or may not ever get out, depending on what the goals are for the people who imprison you. So he's in prison. He does not know. And he still talks about wanting to know the power of Jesus' resurrection. Like, he talks about this in both First Thessalonians and Philippians. He talks about the power that occurs when people hear the gospel, that it's transformative. And yet, instead of talking about the return of Jesus being now and we being alive, he says, I'd be better off if I were to go on and be with Christ, which is a way of saying, it'd be a benefit to me to die and I would immediately be in the presence of Christ. But it's probably better for you and everybody else that I stay here and serve the gospel. So some of that timely urgency and that sense of, I expect to be one of those who are here and caught up into the air is no longer present. You'll see scholars debating whether Paul thinks that he's changed his view. So in 1 Thessalonians, it's clear he thinks that those who are dead, he says, have fallen asleep. They're really dead. They're in the ground until Jesus returns and they're raised. He doesn't use that language in Philippians. He uses the language of going to be immediately with Christ. And has he changed his mind or not? And you'll see, if you check the scholarly literature, they debate whether he changed his mind.
Interesting. Interesting. That sort of, does that presence come for everybody all at once on the last day, or is that something that happens immediately when you die? Wow.
We see traces of both kinds of language in our denominational worship books when it comes to funerals. Sometimes they'll mix them or put them side by side.
Yeah. Interesting. Huh.
I could add, I'll add, and I think my own opinion is what's happened is there were Jews that we know about who believed that martyrs had a special fate when they died. That martyrs would go immediately into the presence of God while everyone else would have to wait on the resurrection. See some of that in Revelation 6, for example. And I think what Paul's anticipating is he might die as a martyr.
Yeah. Interesting.
Is there anything we should pay attention to regarding the locations of these two cities? Thessaloniki, prosperous, what we might call a kind of cosmopolitan city in the ancient world. Philippi, a Roman colony, very Rome. I mean, is there something about Paul's theological language that seems to be getting at issues of allegiance and belonging in the empire, in your view?
I think that what Paul is fundamentally interested in is faithing, which I want to use that term. When we use faith, it's a Greek word translated into Latin. We tend to reduce it to a cognitive thing, but it could be just as well translated as faithfulness or loyalty or something like that. I don't particularly make that much of the difference of the two cities, but that might be because of how little I know. But what I do see in the two letters is this sense of, in each letter, he appeals to the reputation of that group to other groups in the region. To a modern person, these two cities are not far apart. Their cultural histories are quite different. But he thinks of the churches he works with as networked. And so to me, that's where that question of allegiance primarily comes in with Paul.
And allegiance to the other churches, you mean, a kind of
allegiance to Jesus together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, there's a sort of a fondness in both of these letters. We haven't gotten to Galatians yet, or 1st and 2nd Corinthians, but there does seem to be sort of a feeling of warmth that Paul has towards these communities, and maybe especially so in Philippians. I mean, can you talk a little about this aspect of the letters, that sort of affective bond, or maybe it's not just an interpersonal thing, but also a spiritual thing, a sense of gratitude or joy or peace. What are those feelings doing in these letters, or especially Philippians?
Well, in Philippians, he's apparently just received some provisions from the Philippians. And so part of the letter is expressing gratitude for that. And it gets a little touchy. It's hard to tell if he says, "You've revived your concern for me." making one wonder if that might be a little passive aggressive, but even if it is, he quickly, right, goes to talk about his gratitude and the warmth of the relationship. First Thessalonians, the first half of First Thessalonians really almost sounds like, I'm old enough to have written love letters back in the day, like with a pen and paper and a stamp. And I remember the feeling of, you want to evoke the sense of, wasn't it great when we were together? And hoping that the reader recognizes that, oh yeah, it was great. Because if you miss, and in First Thessalonians, he's trying to evoke that. He uses some pretty distinctive language. I was like a nurse among you. You remember what we were like. We were gentle. We weren't exploitative. We didn't lord it over you. Both letters express that kind of warmth. The one thing I would add is Philippians also has a polemical, that is a fighting passage, where he warns the Philippians, watch out for the dogs, the people who are promoting circumcision among you. And he's pretty fierce in that section.
This is a more wizened Paul who's been burned, or is this a particular concern for this community?
That is a question scholars debate. Some wonder whether Philippians is not just one letter, but fragments of letters that were put together, and that section might have once been part of some different letter. I don't know how you evaluate something like that. But when you're reading the letter, it goes quickly from this warmth. There's also in chapter 4, he's trying to resolve a conflict between two women who seem to be prominent in the church, Euodia and Syntyche. And so he's addressing communities as if he's hearing what's going on and knows something about them.
Could you say something about perseverance in that letter too? So Philippians very much, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, let your mind be like Jesus, and the self-giving, self-emptying and handing over of privilege for the sake of the other. And kind of what's going on with that, or how is that important? Is that a sign of Paul maybe seeing that he's at the end of his life and saying, even when I'm gone, keep doing this? Or kind of just talk a bit about that idea of perseverance.
I don't think the language of perseverance is new in his letters. I mean, we see it among the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians, depending on who's translating and how they're translating. So, but I think what is happening in Philippians is he's aware that there are some divisions among the Philippians that he wants to address. So he says, think the same thing, have a common mind. He says that in chapter 4. And then he also says it in chapter 2. And in chapter 2, he either composes or uses sort of a poem or hymn, think the same like Jesus, who in the very form of God didn't try to hold on to that or use it, but emptied himself, taking the form of one who's enslaved. This is one of the places, I'm stepping out a little bit, one of the places where Paul sounds very much like he's been influenced from hearing teachings of Jesus. Using the imagery of slavery, which it's not great language for us, but it was a common reality and metaphor in the ancient world, to say, give up your own prerogatives for one another. If you're in conflict, find ways to agree rather than trying to win. And that is a point of view he emphasizes in Philippians, but also in some of his other letters. He really is trying to build communities that instead of striving for control or status, people look out for one another's interests.
I'm interested in this hymn that you've referred to, but from a slightly different lens of just more the sort of the theological lens, right? So you've talked about sort of what this means for who we are and how we're to be with one another. What is this saying about his either composition or use of this hymn, saying about who Paul understands Jesus to be? Oh,
I thought you're headed somewhere else.
Oh.
So In theology, we talk about kenotic or emptying understandings of Jesus. It's a kind of answer to the question, how can we say Jesus really, 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 really was human and just as really divine? And so Paul says Christ emptied himself. We might, in modern language, say divested himself of the privileges and glory of being a heavenly divine person. And so the story in the hymn moves downward from heaven to earth, that he empties himself, but then also, then he's raised and glorified. And so in the end, it's an apocalyptic vision. Every knee shall bow, every tongue, so he's glorified in the end. So there's this downward movement and an upward movement. That's characteristic of that way of imagining the incarnation and divinity of Jesus. I'll be honest, I find it really attractive because it takes seriously the human experience of Jesus.
And it's somewhat revolutionary in the ancient world as well, right? Where a lot of the Greek and Roman gods were takers. They were right. They were happy to hold on to the prerogatives of divinity.
And fight over the privileges among them. But I would add, though, don't our gods reflect us? And say as much about our own culture and how it works. And so, when you have gods squabbling and fighting in that way, it's not hard to imagine a culture in which people are scrambling for a place, and where you perceive that as, your neighbors as potential opponents. And what if some of the appeal of what Paul's doing in these communities is building communities where mutual regard and sometimes yielding for the welfare of others, even yielding for the welfare of people who have less influence or status or security than you do. That's Paul. And, I would add that's also the way of Jesus. It's one of the places that I think that Paul has heard and received teachings of Jesus and embodies them in the work that he's doing.
Yeah.
I think that is a beautiful summary and actually a beautiful place to end, that drawing together of Paul's understanding of Jesus and his message to these communities that he's writing to. Greg, Carey, we are so grateful to you for being with us and for helping to illuminate these letters for us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you both.
Thanks, Greg.